My name is Helen Fraser, and the moment I heard my husband laughing behind that closed door while discussing how quickly my mother's property could be put to use, I knew my marriage was not what I thought it was. I stood in the hallway, with my coat still on the smell of cold rain, clinging to the fabric. I had not even taken off my shoes. The house was warm, too warm, as if life inside had continued without any pause at all. My heart was racing, not only from the long drive back from the funeral home, but from the weight of grief that had not yet settled into anything I could name. I had come home from my mother's funeral less than an hour earlier. The service had been quiet and respectful, the way she would have wanted it. A small chapel near the water, a few old friends, no fuss. She had lived her last years with dignity and independence, and I thought I was honoring her by carrying myself the same way, head up shoulders, steady no tears, in public. All the way home, I rehearsed what I was going to say. I planned to sit down at the kitchen table with my husband and his parents, pour a cup of tea, and tell them calmly that my mother had left me 3 apartments and a beachfront home in Vancouver. Not to boast, not to make a scene, just to be honest, to finally share something that mattered. But before I could say a word, I heard them. Their voices came from the den, low, but clear enough through the door. My husband's voice, first relaxed, almost cheerful. His mother answered him, practical and sharp. His father added a comment that made them all laugh. They were talking about timelines, about selling one place, renting another, about how Helen wouldn't want to manage all that stress anyway. I froze. They had not seen me. They did not know I was home, and in that small mercy, they showed me the truth. I leaned my hand against the wall to steady myself. The grief I had been holding back finally mixed with something colder. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to recognition. My mother had warned me gently more than once. She never accused. She never interfered. She only said things like, "Make sure you always know where you stand," or "Don't assume silence means agreement." At the time, I thought she was being cautious. Now I understood she was being clear. As I listened, I realized they were not speaking with cruelty. That almost made it worse. They spoke as if the outcome was already decided, as if my role was simply to comply. They were planning a future that included my inheritance, but not my voice. I stepped back from the door without making a sound. In that moment, memories came back to me in sharp detail. Family dinners where decisions were announced rather than discussed. Conversations where my opinion was acknowledged politely and then ignored. Years of contributing quietly, financially, emotionally, without ever being fully seen as an equal. I thought of my mother again, a woman who worked until she was 68, who paid off her own mortgage, who never asked for help she had not earned. The properties she left me were not luck or indulgence. They were the result of disciplined sacrifice and foresight, and she had chosen me deliberately to carry that forward. I walked into the kitchen and set my purse down gently. I did not announce myself. I did not interrupt them. I simply stood there, breathing, letting the reality settle. I was not ready to confront anyone, not yet. Instead, I went upstairs and changed out of my funeral clothes. I folded the black dress carefully and placed it in the back of the closet. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a woman in her early 60s who had spent too long being agreeable. Not weak, just quiet. There is a difference. Downstairs, the voices continued. They did not sound worried. They sounded confident. I sat on the edge of the bed and made a decision that surprised even me. I would say nothing today. I would not reveal what my mother had left me. I would not argue, explain, or defend. I would listen. I would observe. And I would learn exactly how far they believed their entitlement extended. Grief does strange things. It strips away patience for nonsense. It sharpens your sense of what matters. As I sat there, I realized that my mother's final gift might not be the properties at all, but the clarity that came with losing her. When I finally went back downstairs, the conversation stopped abruptly. My husband looked up surprised, but not alarmed. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was tired, which was true. I said I would rest. No one mentioned the inheritance. No one asked what the lawyer had said. No one offered to give me space. They simply returned to their routines, confident that nothing had changed. But something had. That night, lying in bed, beside my husband, listening to his breathing, even out into sleep, I stared at the ceiling and thought about doors. Some are meant to be opened, others reveal more when they are left closed. Tomorrow, I told myself I would begin to understand exactly what my mother had prepared me for. I did not sleep much that night. When morning came, it arrived quietly, the gray Vancouver light pressing through the curtains like a question I could no longer avoid. I moved through the house before anyone else was awake. The kettle clicked on the familiar sound, steadying me. I stood at the kitchen counter, with my hands wrapped around a mug, staring out at the back lane, where delivery trucks passed, and neighbors walked their dogs, life continuing at its usual pace. It struck me how ordinary everything looked, even though something fundamental had shifted inside me. I thought about my marriage, not the way I once described it to friends, but the way it had actually been lived. We had been together for more than 30 years. We raised a child, paid off a modest home, attended family events, and kept up appearances. On paper, it was a solid life. In practice, it had always leaned slightly in one direction. I had been the listener, the planner, the one who adjusted. When my husband's parents needed help, I rearranged my schedule. When holidays were discussed, their preferences set the tone. When finances came up, I was trusted to manage day-to-day matters, but not long-term decisions. I had accepted these patterns quietly, telling myself this was simply how families worked. That compromise was a sign of maturity. My mother had never interfered. She watched, she listened, and she remembered everything. When I visited her apartment, she would ask gentle questions. Are you happy, or do you feel heard? I always answered yes, because it seemed easier than examining the truth. As I stood there that morning, I realized how often I had confused peace with absence of conflict. Later that day, my husband mentioned casually that his parents might stop by in the afternoon. He spoke as if it were already decided. I nodded, just as I always had. But inside, I noticed the habit, for the first time, how consent was assumed rather than requested. When his parents arrived, they were polite and warm. Coffee was poured, biscuits were offered. Conversation stayed safely on the surface. They asked about the funeral, spoke kindly of my mother, and told stories from years past. It would have been easy to believe the night before had never happened. But I listened differently now. I noticed how often my husband answered on my behalf, how his mother referred to family assets when discussing hypothetical futures, how they spoke with certainty about plans that had never been discussed openly. At one point, his father said, "Your mom was smart to invest early." Vancouver property always pays off. He smiled at me, as if we were sharing a private understanding. I smiled back carefully. What struck me most was not their greed, but their assumption. They believed I would naturally step aside, the way I always had, that I would see their comfort as my responsibility. That afternoon, after they left, I went for a long walk by the seawall. The air was cold, but the movement helped clear my thoughts. I thought about my mother again, how she never asked permission to secure her future, how she trusted me to do the same. I also thought about myself at 25, newly married, eager to belong. Somewhere along the way, belonging had turned into disappearing. By the time I returned home, I had made a quiet decision. Before I spoke to anyone about the inheritance, I needed to understand my legal standing. Not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. The next morning, I called the lawyer my mother had named in her will. His assistant scheduled an appointment for later that week. The calm professionalism of the conversation grounded me. There was no drama in it, just process, just facts. At home, nothing appeared to change. My husband kissed me goodbye before work. We discussed groceries and errands. But beneath it all, I felt a growing distance. Not emotional, but observational. I was no longer inside the situation. I was watching it. That evening, my husband mentioned renovations offhandedly. If we ever had extra income, he said we could finally redo the kitchen. I asked him what he meant. "Oh, just thinking out loud," he replied quickly. I nodded, but I did not reassure him. I did not fill the silence. Later, lying in bed, I thought again about the door I had stood behind the night before. How easily it had opened my eyes. I realized then that my marriage was not built on cruelty or betrayal, but on imbalance. An imbalance left unaddressed can be just as damaging. I did not hate my husband. I did not plan to punish him. What I wanted was something simpler and harder, to be recognized as a full person with boundaries that mattered. As sleep finally came, I understood something my mother had always known. Love without clarity invites entitlement, and clarity once gained cannot be unlearned. The lawyer's office was on the 10th floor of a downtown building I had passed hundreds of times without noticing. Glass doors, neutral carpet, a quiet waiting area that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic happened, and that I realized was exactly what I needed. I arrived early and sat with my purse on my lap, reviewing nothing in particular. When my name was called, I followed the assistant into a modest office where a man in his late 50s stood to greet me. He spoke gently, without hurry, and offered condolences for my loss before anything else. That small courtesy mattered more than he probably knew. He explained the process carefully, step by step, probate registration titles. There were documents, already prepared instructions my mother had left with surprising precision. 3 apartments each, registered solely in my name. 1 beachfront home, purchased years earlier and maintained meticulously. No joint ownership, no ambiguity. As he spoke, I felt something in my chest loosen. Not relief exactly, but grounding. The law, in this case, was not an enemy or an obstacle. It was simply a framework that recognized reality. He made it clear that under Canadian law, inherited property remained mine unless I chose otherwise. Marriage did not change that. No one could claim it by assumption or proximity. I nodded as he spoke, taking in each sentence as if it were a lesson I had waited too long to learn. I asked questions, practical ones. about taxes, about management, about responsibilities I had never imagined carrying on my own. He answered patiently, never talking down to me, never rushing. When I admitted that I felt overwhelmed, he smiled and said that was normal. That many people my age came in after years of letting others speak for them. I left the office with a thin folder and a heavier sense of myself. Outside, the city moved as usual. Buses pulled in and out. People hurried past with phones pressed to their ears. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, holding the folder close, and felt my mother's presence more clearly than I had at the funeral. Not as grief, but as intention. At home, I placed the folder in a drawer in my bedside table. I did not tell my husband about the meeting, not because I was hiding something, but because I was not ready to share it yet. Information I was learning did not always need to be announced immediately. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle shifts in the house. Conversations that danced around money, suggestions framed as jokes, a comment from my mother-in-law about how difficult it must be to manage property at our age. Each remark landed differently now. I no longer absorbed them. I examined them. One evening, my husband asked if I had heard from the lawyer. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on my face longer than usual. I told him I had an appointment coming up, which was true in a way. I did not elaborate. He nodded and changed the subject. That night, I lay awake thinking about how easily silence had become my default, how often I had believed that speaking less made things smoother. The law had given me clarity, but it also gave me responsibility. To myself, to the years I still had ahead of me. A week later, I returned to the lawyer's office to finalize paperwork. We discussed next steps, setting up a separate account for property income, hiring a management company, for the apartments, arranging insurance. He encouraged me to take my time, to make decisions deliberately. There was no rush. On the way home, I stopped at a small cafe near the water. I sat alone with a cup of tea, watching the tide move in and out. It occurred to me that this was the first major decision I had made entirely on my own in a long time, and it felt neither frightening nor selfish. It felt appropriate. When I got home, my husband was in the living room. He asked how my day had been. I told him it was productive. He smiled, but there was uncertainty behind it. I realized then that my quiet confidence was new to him, perhaps unsettling. We ate dinner together, talking about ordinary things. I noticed how often he looked at me as if waiting for something I was not ready to give. I did not feel guilty. I felt careful. Before bed, I took the folder from the drawer and read through the documents once more. My name appeared again and again, printed clearly without qualification. It was not just legal recognition. It was affirmation. I understood now that revenge did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as knowledge, as preparation, as the simple refusal to be assumed. And in that quiet understanding, I felt stronger than I had in years. RDS silence. I learned changes shape once you choose it deliberately. In the weeks that followed my meetings with the lawyer, I spoke less at home, not out of fear, but out of intention. I stopped filling gaps in conversation. I stopped explaining myself preemptively. I listened the way I always had, but now I listened with a purpose. I was not waiting to respond. I was observing. It was surprising how much people revealed when they assumed nothing was being recorded, not on paper, but in memory. My husband's family visited more often. They came with baked goods and careful smiles, with questions that sounded like concern, and comments that felt like forecasts. His mother would say things like, "You'll want to keep things simple," or "Managing property can be tiring at our stage of life." His father mentioned a friend who had downsized at the right time. No one said my name when they spoke about decisions. They used "we" as if it included me by default. At first, I felt a familiar pull to reassure them, to say I appreciated their help, to smooth things over. The impulse rose quickly, as it always had, but I let it pass. Instead, I took notes, quiet ones, dates, phrases, patterns. I saved messages that hinted at expectations. I paid attention to who spoke and who deferred. I was not building a case against anyone. I was building a clear picture for myself. I also made changes that were less visible. I opened a separate bank account in my own name, something I had not done in decades. It felt oddly ceremonial, signing the forms at the branch where the teller addressed me directly, without asking for my husband. I arranged for a property management firm to handle the apartments, choosing one recommended by the lawyer. They spoke to me professionally, without assumptions. It felt like stepping into a room where my presence was expected. At home, my husband noticed the shifts, though he did not name them. He asked if I was tired more often, if I wanted help with errands, if everything was all right. I answered honestly, but briefly. "I'm managing," I said. And I was. One afternoon, his mother called while I was out walking by the inlet. She spoke warmly, then moved gently into advice. She suggested that I should consider letting family take some of the load. I listened until she finished, then thanked her for her concern. I did not agree. I did not disagree. I simply ended the call. That evening, I told my husband I had scheduled a therapy appointment. He looked surprised. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "Not wrong," I said. "Just overdue." I grew up in a generation that rarely spoke about counseling. We were taught to endure quietly, to keep personal matters within the family. But I had reached a point where endurance felt less like strength and more like habit. Therapy was not a reaction to crisis. It was a recalibration. The therapist was a woman around my age, calm and direct. She asked about my marriage, my childhood, my mother. She did not rush me toward conclusions. She listened as carefully as I now tried to listen to others. Over several sessions, I began to hear my own voice more clearly. How often it softened statements that deserved firmness, how often it deferred when it wanted to assert. She said something once that stayed with me. Silence can protect you, or it can erase you. The difference is choice. At home, conversations continued to circle the same topics. Renovations, future plans, what made sense. I allowed those discussions to happen without committing to anything. My husband began to look uneasy. The certainty he had relied on was gone. One evening, during dinner, he mentioned the idea of selling one of the apartments if it ever came up. His tone was casual, but his eyes searched mine. I took a sip of water before answering. "I'm not considering any changes right now," I said. He nodded, but he did not press. The moment passed, but something lingered. For the first time, I had not softened my boundary. As days turned into weeks, I felt a steadiness settle in. Not confidence, exactly, something quieter. A sense that I was finally aligned with myself. I no longer felt the need to prepare explanations in advance. If questions came, I would answer them when they did not before. I began meeting friends for coffee again, women I had known for years. We spoke about grandchildren, health, retirement plans. When I mentioned the inheritance briefly and without detail, they listened without assumption. One of them said, "It's good you're taking your time." Another said, "Your mum would be proud." Neither suggested what I should do next. That mattered more than I expected. At home, the atmosphere grew more careful. My husband asked before making plans. His parents waited for invitations rather than assuming them. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift in balance. I knew this quiet phase would not last forever. Silence, when chosen, eventually demands words. But I also knew I was no longer afraid of that moment. My mother had taught me, without ever saying it, that preparation is not deceit, that patience is not weakness, and that sometimes the most effective response is to stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. As I lay in bed one night, listening to the rain against the window, I felt something close to peace, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer invisible. And that I understood was the first real step toward any honest reckoning. The moment came quietly, the way most important moments do. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind Vancouver does well. Low clouds, steady light, nothing dramatic in the air. My husband's parents were visiting again. We were sitting around the dining table with tea and leftovers, the conversation drifting the way it always did, comfortably, predictably. Until my mother-in-law said we should really talk about the properties at some point. There it was, not sharp, not rude, just stated as if it were overdue business. I set my cup down carefully. My hand did not shake. "I agree," I said. "We should." The room went quiet in a way I had never felt before. Not awkward exactly, alert. My husband looked at me surprised. His parents leaned forward, slightly attentive. "I've met with the lawyer," I continued. My voice was steady measured. "The properties are legally mine, all of them." My mother was very clear about that. No one interrupted me. I could see questions forming, but I did not rush to answer them. "I won't be selling or transferring anything," I said. "I've arranged professional management. The decisions will be mine, and I'll be taking my time." My father-in-law cleared his throat. "Of course," he said. "We just thought." "I know what you thought," I replied gently, "and I understand why, but those assumptions were made without me." There was no anger in my voice. That was important. I was not there to accuse. I was there to define. My husband spoke, then quietly. "Helen's right. We should have waited." I looked at him. It was the first time he had said something like that in front of his parents. I turned back to the table. "I'm not shutting anyone out," I said. "But I won't be stepping aside anymore. Not with my finances. Not with my decisions." My mother-in-law nodded slowly. She looked uncomfortable, but she did not argue. "We only wanted to help," she said. I believe that I answered. But help requires permission. After they left the house, felt unusually still. My husband and I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, neither of us speaking. "I didn't realize how far things had gone," he said finally. "I know," I replied. "That's part of the problem." We sat down at the table again, just the two of us. I told him about the lawyer, the therapy, the steps I had taken. Not defensively, not dramatically, just factually. I explained that this wasn't about punishment or control. It was about balance. "I'm not leaving," I said, "but I'm not disappearing either." He listened, truly listened. When he spoke, it was slower than usual. He admitted that it had been easier to let his parents lead, that he had mistaken peace for harmony, that he hadn't meant to silence me, but had. We agreed to counseling together, not as a condition, as a commitment. That night, as I went to bed, I felt tired, but lighter, Drawing the line had not broken anything. It had clarified it. For the first time in a long while, I felt respected in my own home. Counseling began the following week in a small office near Commercial Drive, above a bookstore that had been there longer than most of the surrounding cafes. The therapist was a man in his early 60s, calm and direct, someone who understood the long silences of marriages that had endured rather than flourished. He did not rush us. He asked us to speak slowly, to listen without planning responses, to describe what we felt rather than what we assumed. At first, my husband struggled. He spoke in general terms about wanting peace, about not liking conflict. When the therapist asked what peace meant to him, he paused longer than expected. I watched him consider the question, as if it were new. Perhaps it was. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly. I said I had felt invisible in my own life, that I had confused loyalty with self-erasure, that hearing those voices behind the door had not shocked me as much as it should have, because part of me had always known. My husband did not interrupt. That alone felt like progress. Between sessions, his parents kept their distance, not coldly, but cautiously. Invitations were phrased more carefully. Suggestions became questions. I noticed the shift without comment. Boundaries. I was learning rarely announce themselves. They are recognized through changed behavior. One afternoon, my mother-in-law called and asked if she could come by to talk. Just the two of us. I agreed. She arrived with a loaf of bread from a bakery I liked. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where so many decisions had once been assumed. She spoke first. She said she had not realized how much pressure she had placed on me. That in her generation, women often stepped aside without complaint. That she had believed she was helping. I listened. I did not rush to forgive. I did not catalog her words for later use. I simply listened. I need you to understand something, I said when she finished. I won't be managed anymore. Not kindly, not quietly, not at all. She nodded. It was not an easy nod, but it was real. With my husband, the work was slower. We talked about patterns, how decisions had defaulted to his parents, how my silence had reinforced that. He admitted that he had relied on my adaptability, mistaking it for contentment. He apologized. Not once, but more than once. Each time sounded less rehearsed. I did not expect him to change overnight. I did expect consistency. Meanwhile, I continued building a life that did not revolve solely around him. I met with the property managers monthly. I learned how rental income flowed, how maintenance was scheduled, how taxes were planned. It was not glamorous work, but it was empowering. I was competent. I always had been. I also made a choice that surprised my husband. I set aside one of the apartments to support a local housing initiative for older women transitioning out of unstable situations. It was something my mother had once spoken about, quietly, without expectation. I did not announce it widely. I simply did it. When I told my husband, he looked at me for a long moment. "I didn't know you wanted that," he said. "I did," I replied. "I just hadn't learned how to say it yet." That sentence stayed with both of us. By early spring, the tension in the house had eased into something more honest. Not perfect, but open. My husband asked before making plans. He listened when I spoke. His parents accepted invitations rather than issuing them. One evening, as we walked along the seawall together, he reached for my hand. Not out of habit, but deliberately. I let him. I thought of my mother then, not with grief, but with gratitude. She had not left me a script to follow. She had left me options, and the courage to choose among them. Accountability, I realized, was not about blame. It was about recognition of harm done, of work required, of change possible. And for the first time in many years, I felt that whatever came next would be faced honestly, by choice, rather than default. Spring arrived gently that year, as it often does in Vancouver. Cherry blossoms opened without ceremony along the streets, and the air carried a sense of renewal that felt earned rather than forced. I found myself noticing small things again: the rhythm of my mornings, the way light moved across the living room floor, the sound of gulls near the water. Life had not become perfect, but it had become mine. The apartments were running smoothly under professional management. I reviewed reports once a month, asked questions, learned steadily. The beachfront home remained untouched for the time being. I visited it alone one afternoon, standing on the deck with the wind coming in from the water. I imagined my mother there, not watching me, but trusting me. That mattered. My husband and I continued counseling. Some sessions were quiet, others were uncomfortable, but there were no longer topics we avoided. We spoke about retirement plans, about what we wanted the next chapter to look like, not as a couple performing stability, but as two individuals choosing it. One evening, he said something that stayed with me. "I didn't realize how much I leaned on your silence," he admitted. "I thought it meant everything was fine." I told him gently that silence often means someone has given up trying to be heard. He nodded. He did not argue. His parents adjusted in their own way. They were polite, careful, more distant than before. But there was a new respect in that distance. They no longer spoke for me. They no longer planned around me. That, I realized, was reconciliation, not closeness at any cost, but clarity with boundaries intact. I honored my mother quietly. I used one apartment to support housing for older women, just as I had planned. I did not do it for praise. I did it because it aligned with who she was and who I had finally allowed myself to be. Sometimes I thought back to that moment in the hallway, standing outside the closed door. How close I had been to walking in, announcing myself, explaining, defending. How different everything might have been if I had. What my mother truly left me was not property. It was perspective. She taught me, without speeches, without instructions, that dignity is built through preparation, not reaction. That love should never require disappearance, and that it is never too late to step fully into your own life. If you are listening to this and recognizing parts of yourself in my story, I hope you take something practical from it. Know your rights. Ask questions. Seek advice before assumptions are made for you. Silence can be powerful, but only when it is chosen, not imposed. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or of a moment when you chose yourself a little more clearly, I invite you to reflect on it. Share it with someone who might need it. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, late life clarity and dignity earned over time, consider subscribing. Thank you for listening.